Chapter 11, Part 1. My promise to Grandpa about being ready and waiting for our trip to town got sidetracked during the night. I was sound asleep the next morning when Papa opened the door to my room. "You better get up," Papa said. "Your Grandpa's here and he's waiting for you." "Grandpa's already here?" I said, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "What time is it anyway?" "It's just breaking daylight," Papa said. "You better hurry now. Your Grandpa's raring to go." I flew out of bed and jumped into my clothes. As I stepped into the kitchen, I saw to my surprise that everybody in the family was up. Mama was fixing breakfast and Daisy was setting the table. Papa and Grandpa were drinking coffee. "Boy," I said as I poured water into the washpan, "this early in the morning and everybody stirring around." Looking at Grandpa, Mama said, "Papa, this is the silliest thing I ever heard of. An old codger like you going to town to read monkey books." Grandpa snorted and said, "I can't see anything silly about it. We don't know anything about catching monkeys. Maybe in the library we can learn from a book something about how to catch them. It's worth a try anyway." Daisy said, "Grandpa, have you ever been in a library?" Grandpa squirmed a little and said, "No, I haven't, but I understand that anyone can go to a library, and there's always a first time for everything." It was 12 miles from where we lived in the hills to the little town of Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and it would take a good part of the day to get there. As soon as breakfast was over, Grandpa looked at me and said, "We better be on our way. I have a lot of things to do in town." Mama, Papa, and Daisy followed us out to Grandpa's buckboard. Roddy was sitting in the spring seat looking at us, whimpering and whining. His old tail was wagging so fast that I just knew it was going to come unscrewed from his body. Grandpa chuckled and said, "Would you look at that? He knows that we're going somewhere and he's bound and determined to go with us." "Rowdy," I said in a hard voice, "you get down out of that buckboard. You can't go into town with us. What's the matter with you anyway?" Rowdy dropped his old head and wouldn't even look at me. His tail was the first part of him to die. Very slowly it started wiggling. It stopped wiggling. To make things worse, he squirmed his rear end around until his tail was hanging over the back of the spring seat. It just hung there all limp and lifeless and looked like a dead grapevine. Rowdy's sympathy-getting act melted Grandpa's heart. He glanced at Rowdy, then turned to me and said, "I don't see why Rowdy couldn't go to town with us. Lots of people take their dogs to town." "Oh, Grandpa," I said, "if we took him to town with us, there's no telling what might happen." Grandpa said, "I don't see how Rowdy could get in any trouble in town. We're going to stay at the wagon yard, and you could tie him up under the buckboard. He'd be all right." Grandpa said, "I'd like to take Rowdy to town with us. I don't like to go anywhere without him, but I'm afraid I might lose him in that big town. If that happened, I'd just die." Rowdy knew that we were talking about him. With a low moan, he lay down on the spring seat and closed his eyes. He must have been holding his breath because I couldn't see one speck of life anywhere in his body. His dying act really stirred everybody up. "All right," I said, throwing up my hands. "I give up. He can go with us, but I don't like it. I don't like it at all. I just hope that everything comes out all right." Grandpa climbed into the buckboard, gathered up the check lines, and said, "We better be on our way. We have wasted a good hour as it is." Mama came over to me and started laying down the 10,000 laws that all mamas have for their going away boys. Things like being a good boy, minding Grandpa, washing my face, combing my hair, and saying my prayers when I went to bed. I just stood there and waited until Mama ran out of breath, and I said, "Mama, I can't understand you sometimes. Every time you send me to the store, I don't care if it's 2 or 3 little old things, you always write them down on a piece of paper. But if I'm going away for a day or two, you tell me 10,000 things to do and you never write anything down. Why, Mama, I couldn't remember all those things if I had 10 heads." Mama smiled and said, "I don't expect you to do everything I ask you to do, but if you do just a few of them, I'll be satisfied." Daisy giggled and said, "Jay Barry, you sure would look funny running around with 10 heads. Boy, wouldn't you be something to see." Everyone but me was still laughing at Daisy's remarks when Grandpa said, "Get up," to the mares. Just as we were leaving, Daisy yelled, "Jay Barry, you better not forget my ribbon. If you do, you better not come home." I didn't even look back at her. The road we followed stayed at the edge of the foothills for a short distance, and then it made a right turn and ran down into the river bottoms. We had no more than entered the bottoms when things began to happen. Rabbits, squirrels, groundhogs, and quail began darting across the road. Once a mama deer with a spotted baby leaped across the road and disappeared in a thick canebrake. Rowdy was on needles and pins. Every time something would zip across the road, his ears would stand straight up. He would fidget around on the spring seat, whimper and whine. He wanted to chase something so bad he could hardly stand it. I understood Rowdy's feelings. I loved him up a little and said, "I know how you feel, boy, but just let on like you don't see a thing. We don't have time to stop and let you do any hunting." Grandpa laughed. "I don't believe that I've ever seen so much game in the river bottoms," he said. "After we catch those monkeys, maybe we can take a few days off and really do some hunting." "I'd like that, Grandpa. I said, and I know Rowdy would. About halfway through the bottoms, the road made a sharp left turn. Just as we made the turn, a big old mama coon with three little babies waddled across the road. This was too much for Rowdy. He just simply couldn't stand it any longer. Letting out a bellow that all but busted my eardrums and came close to scaring the mares out of their harness, he leaped down from the buckboard and took off after the coon. I stood up in the buckboard and yelled as loud as I could. Roddy, you better leave those baby coons alone. That old mama coon will skin you alive. You come back here now. Mumbling something about a yelling boy and a bawling hound, Grandpa finally got the mares settled down. We sat there waiting to see what would happen. From far out in the bottoms, we heard a loud commotion. The mama coon was squalling and Rowdy was howling like he was hung up in a barbed wire fence. With a worried look on his face, Grandpa said, Boy, they're sure going after it, aren't they? You think Rowdy will be all right? Oh, don't worry about Rowdy, Grandpa, I said. He's been through this 100 times. You'd think that by now he would learn to leave coons alone. He never does, though. He always goes back for more. It wasn't long until the squalling and howling stopped. About a minute later, Rowdy came tearing out of the brush with a sheepish look on his face and with his tail between his legs. I didn't have to tell him to get in the buckboard. He made one leap and landed in the spring seat. He had a raw red scratch on his nose. Rowdy, I said as I rubbed his nose with my hand, I don't believe that you'll ever learn anything. I really don't. You know that you can't whip a coon, especially a mama coon with babies. Chuckling to himself, Grandpa tapped the mares with his buggy whip and said, Well, there's one thing you can say for Rowdy. He sure makes things exciting. Sitting high in the spring seat with my grandpa and my lop-eared hound, no boy could have been happier. Grandpa, I said, I really think we're going to catch those monkeys this time, don't you? Grandpa smiled. I wouldn't be a bit surprised, he said. If there's a book in that library that can tell us how to catch monkeys, we'll catch them all right. Yes, sirree, those monkeys have won the first few rounds, but they can't win all the time. For the 100th time, I began to plan what I would do when I got my pony in 22. On reaching the river, I knew we had to cross it, but I wasn't prepared for what took place. Grandpa stopped the team. He looked at me and said, I saw a painting once that showed a little boy and his grandpa crossing a stream with a wagon and team. The little boy was driving. The name of the painting was The Big Moment. How about you and I paint? How about you and I painting a picture of our own? You drive across the river. I was so stunned and scared I couldn't say a word. I just sat there with my mouth open, staring at Grandpa. Come on, Grandpa said, offering me the reins. There's nothing to it. I was so scared I had to swallow 4 or 5 times before any words came out. Oh no, Grandpa, I said. I don't think I'd better do any driving. Papa lets me drive our old mules once in a while, but I don't know about driving these mares. They're kind of spooky. Ah, Grandpa said, offering me the reins again. Come on, drive them across. I'll tell you, there's nothing to it. Fellow never knows what he can do until he tries. Half of me was saying, take the reins. The other half was saying, jump out of the buckboard and run. I didn't even know I had the reins in my hands until I looked down, and there they were. Chuckling, Grandpa tapped the mares with his buggy whip, and the buckboard eased into the river. I didn't do any driving at all. I just sat there as stiff as a boat paddle, staring across the river at the faraway bank that looked like it was 100 miles away. About halfway across the river, I glanced down at the water and came close to screaming. The water was almost up to the bed of the buckboard. Roddy must have seen the same thing I had, and got scared. He started whimpering and whining and fidgeting on the spring seat. Rowdy, I said in a quavering voice, if you don't sit still and stop that whining, I'll put a muzzle on you and leave it on for 10 years. Laughing, Grandpa said, That's about as deep as it will get. From here on across, it's not so deep. I glanced down again, and sure enough, I could see that it was getting more shallow. I began to get a little of my courage back, but not very much. On reaching the other side of the river, I stopped the team and handed the reins to Grandpa. As I turned loose of the leather, I saw that my hands were so wet with sweat that they looked as wet as they did when I washed the dishes for Mama once in a while. Grandpa smiled and said, See how easy it was? There wasn't anything to it, was there? Glancing back across the river, I said, Wait till I tell Daisy about this. She won't believe it, though. Tapping the mares with his buggy whip, Grandpa said, You think it'll do any good? I'll be a witness for you. About noon, we drove into the town of Tahlequah. Just before we entered the main street, off to my right, I saw several large buildings. They were on a small hill in the middle of about 10 acres of beautiful green lawn. Huge red oaks, white oaks, maple, locust, and elm trees were growing here and there on the lawn. In the shade of those beautiful trees, small groups of people were either sitting or lying on the green grass. Practically everybody had a book in his hand. I thought, the people in this town really like to read books. Grandpa, I asked, what are all those buildings up there? Those buildings are the pride and joy of the Cherokee Nation, he said. That's their college. What are all those people doing under the trees? I asked. Those are students, Grandpa said. They're probably studying their lessons. They have their classes inside those buildings. And we're going to say the class that they are studying for is Criminology 101 with Dr. Burge. Criminology 101 with Dr. Burge. Burge. Back to the reading. That wouldn't be a bad place to go to school, I said. Instead of having to stay in the schoolhouse to study, you could just go outside and sit under a tree. I think I'd like that. I hope I live to see the day when you go to college here, Grandpa said. Do you think you'd like it? I think I would, Grandpa, I said. Not far from the college, we crossed a bridge over a small creek. A sign on the bridge said Bear Creek. Whoa, there's a Bear Creek in Merced. Grandpa said, this is the main street. Tahlequah is a nice town, and it's the county seat of the Cherokee Nation. I had never seen so many buildings. There were little ones and big ones. Some of them were 2 stories high. They lined both sides of the street and were jammed up so close together it looked like you couldn't have driven a nail between them. I had never seen so many people. They were milling around everywhere. Some were going into stores and some were coming out of stores. Others were just walking up and down the streets. I could hear little kids bawling and big kids laughing. A man and his wife passed by. They had so many kids following along behind them they looked like a covey of quails. Everywhere I looked, I could see wagons, buggies, buckboards, and saddle horses. Some were tied to hitching rails, and others were moving along the street. Dogs were barking, and trace chains were jingling. I was still gawking when Grandpa slowed the mares down and said, well, here we are. This is the Eubanks Hotel and Wagon Yard. I'll get us a room in the hotel, and we'll eat our meals there, too. The large 2 story hotel building was on our left. Its second story had a porch that hung out over the sidewalk. I saw several people sitting in chairs up there. They were just sitting there as comfortable as could be, looking the town over. I thought, they sure have a bird's eye view of the town. Grandpa made a left turn off the main street at the hotel and passed under a big arch. About 100 yards behind it was one of the biggest barns I'd ever seen. Above its huge open doors was a sign in big blue letters that said, Eubanks Wagon Yard, 50 cents for teams, 25 cents for feed. Boy, this wagon yard must be doing a lot of business, I said. Do you ever see so many wagons and teams? It's the only wagon yard in town, Grandpa said. They do a good business, all right. The fellow who owns this place is a fine man. He's a good friend of mine. End of part 1.